The hill didn't even have a name. On the maps carried by the battalion staff, it was marked only as Hill 482, a minor rise somewhere in the Central Highlands, one of thousands of ridges swallowed by jungle, fog, and silence. But on the night of March 11th, 1968, that nameless hill became the place where nearly 500 American soldiers unknowingly stood on the edge of annihilation. The men of 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, the Rakkasans, were exhausted. They had spent 3 days patrolling ridgelines that all looked the same, wading through bamboo thickets sharp enough to cut skin, climbing slopes so steep they had to haul each other up by the straps of their packs. By the time they reached Hill 482 late in the afternoon, the only thing on anyone's mind was sleep. It wasn't supposed to be a fighting position, just a temporary overnight stop before pushing deeper into the valley at first light. The officers walked the perimeter, pointed at a few likely approaches, and told the platoons where to dig in. But most foxholes remained shallow. Nobody thought they would need them. The air that night was wet, heavy, and cold, the kind of cold that clings to bone. Fog drifted across the hilltop like a slow-moving tide. Somewhere in the darkness below, a river murmured through black water and fallen logs. Men smoked in silence. Some cleaned their rifles without talking. Others passed around stale sea rations and joked half-heartedly about going home. The jungle around them breathed steadily, the same rhythm it had every night, making it easy to believe the valley was empty. But one man didn't feel at ease. Corporal James Harlan, sniper for Bravo Company, sat apart from the others. He wasn't much older than 19, though his eyes made him seem older, gray, quiet, always studying something distant. His spotter, Private Danny Ruiz, said Harlan had a strange gift. He could hear patterns in noise the way other men identified faces. And that night, Harlan sensed something wrong. It started as a faint tremor, not a sound, more a feeling as if the earth itself was vibrating in tiny, irregular pulses. He lifted his head and listened. The hill seemed still. Then it came again. A faint, metallic tick, almost like a canteen brushing against a belt. Too soft for the others to notice. Too far away to be certain. He nudged Ruiz. "You hear that?" Ruiz paused. "Hear what? Wind? Animals?" "No," Harlan whispered. "It's too steady for animals." Ruiz shrugged, shivering under his poncho. "Man, you're just tired. Everyone's hearing things out here." But Harlan didn't look tired. He looked alert, wired with an edge of unease that he couldn't explain. He slowly lifted the old M40 sniper rifle across his lap, checked the chamber by touch, and scanned the tree line. Far beyond the perimeter, past the dripping vines and layers of fog, something moved, not a shape, not yet, but a displacement of the natural order, a subtle pressure in the air. Harlan had felt it before in other fights, moments before an ambush, seconds before a mortar strike, right before a man stepped on a pressure plate. He walked toward the command post where Captain Markson was hunched over a map lit by a red-filtered flashlight. "Sir," Harlan said quietly, "there's movement out there." The captain didn't look up. "Movement where?" Far beyond the perimeter, past the dripping vines and layers of fog, something moved, not a shape, not yet, but a displacement of the natural order, a subtle pressure in the air. Harlan had felt it before in other fights, moments before an ambush, seconds before a mortar strike, right before a man stepped on a pressure plate. North slope, maybe east, hard to tell through the fog. "Sir," Harlan said quietly, "there's movement out there." The captain clicked off the flashlight, rolled onto his poncho liner, and shut his eyes. Most of the hill followed his example. Harlan opened his mouth but stopped. He knew that tone. The conversation was over. But Harlan didn't sleep. Something was coming. Something big. And by the time the rest of the battalion realized it, it would already be too late. As the final minutes before midnight slipped away, Corporal James Harlan sat alone at the ridge of Hill 482, rifle ready, breath steady, staring into a darkness that seemed to stare back. He didn't know it yet, but before dawn, he would stand between an entire enemy assault force and the unsuspecting battalion sleeping behind him, and he would be the only thing keeping them alive. Midnight came and went, but the fog never lifted. It only thickened, rolling in slow waves across the hilltop until every foxhole became an island. Men slept curled in their ponchos, rifles resting against their shoulders, unaware that the jungle below had gone unnaturally still. Corporal James Harlan remained awake. He sat with his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees, eyes half closed but mind hyper-alert. He wasn't listening for loud noises. He was listening for the wrong ones, the kind that didn't belong in a jungle at night. And then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic murmur, almost like fabric brushing against undergrowth. Too measured to be random, too controlled to be the wind. He tilted his head and let the sound guide him. There again, and again, not close, but not far enough. Harlan pressed his cheek to the damp earth, angling his ear toward the slope. He slowed his breathing until his heartbeat faded in his ears. Now the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, many of them, moving in unison. He instinctively reached for his rifle, rising to a crouch. In the fog, the world became shapes, hulking trees, tangled vines, the faint glow of sleeping soldiers' cigarettes dying in ash. Now the sound was unmistakable. Harlan nudged him with the barrel of his rifle. "Danny, wake up." Ruiz blinked, disoriented. "What time is it?" "Doesn't matter," Harlan whispered. "Get up." Ruiz rubbed his eyes. "Man, you haven't slept in 2 days. You're hearing things again. Stop talking. Listen." At first, Ruiz heard nothing, just the movement of mist across the leaves. Then there it was, so faint it could have been imagination. Ruiz rubbed his eyes. "Man, you haven't slept in 2 days. You're hearing things again." "Doesn't matter," Harlan whispered. "Get up." Ruiz inhaled sharply. "That's not animals." "No," Harlan said. "It's men. A lot of them." Ruiz felt his stomach tighten. "How many?" Harlan hesitated, calculating the rhythm, the pattern. "Company. Sized at least. Maybe more." Ruiz froze. Christ. They hurried to the command post again, but this time when they shook Captain Markson awake, the captain immediately sensed the change in their faces. Harlan spoke clearly, low, urgent. "Sir, there's coordinated movement on the north slope. Maybe several hundred meters out, maybe closer. Footsteps. The cadence matches NVA regulars, not guerrillas." Markson sat up fully now. "How far?" "Inside the valley. Maybe less than a kilometer." Ruiz added, "Sir, they're headed straight toward us." The captain's breath caught. His expression hardened into something more sober than before. He didn't argue this time. "Wake first platoon." Quietly. No lights. The battalion didn't come alive all at once. It stirred like a sleeping animal prodded gently awake. Squad leaders whispered their men into readiness. Machine gunners quietly fed belts into their M60s. Grenadiers loaded 40mm rounds with the dull thump of metal on metal. Harlan guided his sniper rifle toward a small rise overlooking the slope. He extended the bipod and settled into the dirt. The fog pulsed again. Something was moving in it. He put his eye to the scope, an old Starlight night vision device. Grainy and unreliable, but better than nothing. At first, the image was a field of static, and then he saw them. Figures, dozens, maybe hundreds. Tall shadows, slipping between trees like flowing water. They moved in long, silent lines, heads low, rifles slung forward, formation tight. This wasn't a scouting party. It wasn't a small raiding force. It was a coordinated assault group, a full NVA battalion. Harlan felt a chill crawl up his neck. They were moving fast, too fast. Within 30 minutes, they'd hit the perimeter. And the Americans? Only half were awake. Most hadn't even put on their boots. He sprinted back to Captain Markson. "Sir, they're not probing. They're massing. A full battalion, maybe more. They're going to hit the hill." Markson paled. "How long?" 30 minutes, Harlan said. "Maybe less." Markson looked at him as though the reality had just slammed into place. "Get every platoon on the line. Wake the mortar teams. I want flares loaded but not fired. We hold fire until I say." Chaos without noise swept the hilltop. Boots slammed into feet. Helmets snapped on. Ammo belts unrolled like dark serpents in the fog. Harlan returned to his perch, just as a wave of cold wind rolled over the treetops. And then it stopped. The footsteps stopped. Everything stopped. Ruiz whispered, barely audible. Where did they go? Harlan didn't answer. He knew the silence. He'd felt it in other battles. It was the silence right before impact. Then, from somewhere deep in the valley, a distant command shout echoed, sharp and metallic. Harlan's heart dropped. They're charging, and the hill that no one remembered was about to become the center of a storm no one expected to survive. The jungle moved like a living thing, not with the lazy sway of trees or the random rustle of wildlife, but with purpose, with intention. Corporal James Harlan saw it first through the green haze of his starlight scope, a ripple in the darkness where darkness shouldn't move. Then the shadows sharpened into shaped silhouettes of men, gliding through the undergrowth in long, disciplined lines. They were close now, close enough that Harlan could distinguish the faint outlines of pith helmets, the angular frames of AK-47 seconds, the shape of RPG tubes slung over shoulders. On en tire NVA à seule force. And they were fanning out, Harlan whispered into the night. Not to anyone in particular. They're forming attack wedges. Below him, the fog swallowed half the slope, but he could see enough to know this wasn't an ordinary night attack. The formation was too clean, too silent. This was a regiment trained for one thing: overrun tactics. Danny Ruiz crawled up beside him, breath shaking. How many? Hard to say, Harlan murmured. But we're not looking at a company. Maybe 2? 3? Ruiz swallowed hard. Jesus. Across the hilltop, the Rakazans settled behind hastily dug foxholes. Machine guns half ready. Grenade launchers tucked under arms. They still didn't grasp the full scale of what was coming. But Harlan did. The shadows began splitting. One group moving left, another circling right, a third advancing straight up the middle. They're trying to envelop us, he whispered. Ruiz blinked. Do they know we're awake? Not yet, Harlan replied. But they will. The captain crawled over, whispering sharply. Harlan, report. Harlan didn't take his eye off the scope. They're staging. This is a coordinated assault. They're seconds from sprinting. Distance? Maybe 200 yards at the closest point. Markson inhaled sharply. That's way too damn close. He wanted to call mortars. He wanted to fire flares. But doing either now would give away their exact positions. So he held still, waiting for the moment when waiting would be suicide. There was a long, agonizing pause, the kind of pause where men hold their breath without realizing it. Then the jungle exhaled. A single low whistle rose from the valley floor. Not like a bird, not like wind, a signal, and every shadow in the trees froze. Another whistle sounded. Shorter, sharper. The shadows leaned forward. Ruiz whispered, Here it comes. The starlight scope caught it first. One NVA soldier shifting his rifle, tightening his grip. Then another. Then entire lines, dozens of them coiling like springs. Harlan steadied his rifle. If the NVA charged in full synchronization, they would hit the perimeter like a tidal wave. Machine guns wouldn't have time to adjust. Mortars would be too slow. And half the battalion was still groggy from sleep. Someone had to break the timing. Someone had to break the shape of the wave. Harlan's heartbeat slowed. He tracked the lead officer, the one carrying binoculars, pointing directions to the assault teams. In the murky glow of the scope, Harlan saw the man raise his hand, preparing to give the final signal. One gesture, 1 second. That's all it would take to send hundreds of men charging uphill. Harlan exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like a whip, echoing across the valley. Far below, the lead officer's head jerked violently. He collapsed backward into the men behind him, sending one line stumbling out of formation. The jungle erupted in panicked whispers. Ruiz whispered, Holy crap, you took out their leader. But Harlan wasn't looking at the body. He was watching the effect. The clean wedge formation wavered. Men hesitated. Confusion spread. He fired again. Another soldier dropped one carrying an RPG. Then a third shot, this one hitting a radio man clutching a field phone. Every bullet struck not just a target but the coordination of the attack. Captain Markson stared at the unfolding chaos, stunned. "You're disrupting their timing." Harlan didn't answer. He was already repositioning to a new patch of brush, making sure no muzzle flash betrayed him twice. But now the enemy knew something. They weren't alone. A sharp crack of AK fire cut through the jungle. Then another, and another. The NVA weren't charging yet, but they were trying to locate the lone shooter who had thrown their entire plan off balance. A whisper rolled up the hill like a cold wind. "They're hunting me." Ruiz grabbed his sleeve. "We gotta fall back." But Harlan shook his head. "If I fall back now, they'll recover. They'll charge while our guys are half asleep. There'll be nothing left by sunrise." He slung the rifle, crawled 10 feet to a new vantage point, and set up again. Below him, the NVA reorganized, circling like wolves, searching for the sniper who had broken their rhythm. The shadows were moving again, closer, angrier, faster. Ruiz whispered, "James, they're coming straight for us." Harlan didn't flinch. "Good," he said quietly. "That means they're not going after the battalion." And he sighted in again. The jungle didn't explode all at once. It tightened like a fist closing in the dark. After Harlan's first sniper round shattered the lead officer's skull, the entire NVA assault froze for a heartbeat. Soldiers crouched, rifles jerking upward, eyes scanning the fog-drenched hillside for the unseen shooter. Their formation so precise moments before wavered like a disrupted marching line. Then came the whispering. Soft, urgent, carried by dozens of voices. They weren't panicking. They were recalculating. Captain Markson crawled beside Harlan, breathing hard. "You just bought us time, but they're going to hit us even harder now." Harlan kept his eye in the scope. "Then I'll slow them down again." Markson stared, baffled. "How?" "They're already spreading into attack lanes. Watch." Harlan tracked the next target, a tall NVA soldier adjusting an RPG launcher. In an overrun attack, RPGs weren't just weapons, they were battering rams, blowing open defensive lines so infantry could pour through. Harlan fired. The shot snapped through the fog and punched the RPG gunner off his feet, sending the tube tumbling downhill. The men beside him collapsed in confusion, scattering. Ruiz whispered, "They're losing their angles. They can't keep formation." Another NVA officer sprinted across the slope, waving his arm to restore alignment. Harlan shot him too. A third. A fourth. His rifle cracked again and again, each round a needle thread through the chaos, each target chosen not for impact, but for influence. And the NVA felt it. They began firing blindly into the trees, muzzle flashes stabbing holes through the darkness. Leaves exploded around Harlan's head as bullets hissed past like angry insects. "They've spotted our ridge," Ruiz shouted. "We're pinned." "No," Harlan answered calmly. "They're guessing." The fog still protected him. But not for long. The enemy was moving faster now, closing the distance not in organized wedges but in angry, tightening clusters. Markson radioed frantically. "Alpha, Bravo, Delta, get set. Weapons up, they're advancing." Machine gunners slammed ammo belts into their M60s. Mortar crews crouched over their tubes, waiting for flare orders. Riflemen peered into the fog, hands shaking, breath steaming. But the first impact wouldn't hit the line. It would hit Harlan. The NVA had discovered something unusual. Their entire assault was being delayed, crippled by one shooter. And they wanted him dead. A sudden burst of coordinated AK fire ripped through the brush around Harlan's position. Bark sprayed across his face. Ruiz yanked him by the collar, dragging them both deeper into cover as more bullets tore through the tree they'd been leaning against. "They're triangulating us," Ruiz cried. "They're using crossfire to box us in." Harlan rolled, chambered another round, and crawled to a new vantage point just inches from a rain-soaked log. He didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. He already knew where to aim. Through a narrow slit between two ferns, he spotted an NVA squad leader signaling troops with a flashlight hooded by his hand. Harlan steadied his breathing. One shot. The man dropped. He already knew where to aim. The radio clattered on the ground. A second of silence. Then the entire left flank stalled. Another team rushed forward. Harlan fired again, hitting the radio man, carrying a field phone on his back. Ruiz looked like he was watching a magician. "You're dismantling their chain of command." Down below, discipline began to fracture. NVA squads overlapped. Shouts of confusion spread. Some soldiers ducked, others charged too early. Leaders barked orders, only to fall before finishing their words. Then the jungle erupted with a new sound. A single explosive shout, raw, furious, unified. The NVA had reached a conclusion. If they couldn't outmaneuver the sniper, they would drown him with bodies. A wave of shadows surged uphill, dozens of silhouettes rushing through the fog in a full-speed sprint. Branches snapped under their boots. Muzzle flashes flickered like angry fireflies. Markson shouted into the radio, "Open fire! Open fire!" But the NVA weren't aimed at the battalion. Not yet. They were aimed at the tiny patch of jungle where Harlan had been firing from. Ruiz's eyes widened. "They're coming straight for us, James. That's a platoon." Harlan's fingers tightened on the stock. He whispered, calm, resolved. "Then we hold them here." He fired again, and again. Each shot precise, each shot urgent, each shot desperate. The shadows kept coming, and Corporal James Harlan alone on the ridge, prepared to fight an entire assault team by himself, buying every second he could for the men behind him. The first NVA soldier burst through the fog less than 40 yards away. The real battle had begun. The first NVA soldier emerged from the fog like a phantom helmet glistening with dew, rifle raised, breath steaming in the cold night air. He spotted movement Harlan shifting behind a fallen log and fired a burst of AK rounds that tore chunks of bark into the air. The muzzle flash lit his face for a fraction of a second. That was enough. Harlan fired one clean shot. The soldier collapsed forward, sliding onto the wet leaves without a sound. But the rest were already coming. More silhouettes appeared, 5, then 8, then an entire wedge pushing up the slope, slipping between trees, crouched low, rifles blazing. Bullets chewed into the ground inches from Harlan's boots. Ruiz scrambled behind a stump, fumbling to reload magazines with trembling hands. "James, there's too many. We gotta fall back." But Harlan had already moved, not retreating, repositioning. He crawled through the brush like a shadow himself, sliding into a new firing angle. The fog helped him. It blinded the attackers as much as it blinded him. Every time they thought they'd pinned him down, he disappeared again, slipping into another pocket of darkness. This wasn't a duel. It was a dance in the dark, and Harlan knew every step by instinct. The second wave appeared this one more disciplined, firing in controlled bursts, sweeping the ridge systematically. They were getting closer, the muzzle flashes brightening, the gunfire sharpening into a constant roar. Harlan breathed out slowly. He fired. A machine gunner dropped. He slid left. He fired again. The assistant gunner fell beside him. The heavy weapon clattered uselessly onto the ground, another threat neutralized. Below, the NVA soldiers hesitated. Their assault wedge had lost 2 key shooters in seconds. They scanned the darkness, shouting commands, but the sniper's location shifted constantly. Ruiz crawled beside him, whispering frantically, "Every time you shoot, they get angrier. They're gonna rush this entire spot." "I know," Harlan murmured. "That's the point." "What?" "If they focus on me, they're not focusing on the battalion." A sudden burst of gunfire ripped across the ridge, forcing both men flat. Bullets sliced through leaves above their heads. One round grazed Ruiz's shoulder. He yelped and pressed a hand to the wound, eyes wide with terror. "They're flanking," Ruiz gasped. "They're coming up both sides." Harlan peeked over the log. The fog shimmered with movement. This was no longer a probing attack. This was extermination. The enemy had identified the threat, and they were committing bodies to remove it. A full platoon, maybe more, charging uphill in a staggered line, each soldier covering the next. It looked like a tide of shadows, and those shadows were getting dangerously close. Harlan steadied his breathing, sighting in on the lead runner. He fired. The man spun sideways, crashing into the brush. Another soldier stepped over him, firing upwards, yelling something in Vietnamese. Harlan fired again, hitting the man square in the chest. Still they came. Then, suddenly the jungle behind Harlan lit up. M60 machine guns opened fire from the American perimeter, sending streams of tracers slicing through the fog like streaks of red lightning. The ground shook as dozens of rifles joined in. The battalion was awake now, fully awake. and the hillside erupted with American firepower. Markson's voice roared over the radio. "All units hold the line. Do not let them reach the ridge." For the first time that night, Harlan felt a flicker of comfort. The others were aware. They were firing. They were alive. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. Because the NVA didn't break. They didn't run. They split. Half continued toward the main perimeter. The other half, still furious, turned directly toward Harlan's position, determined to crush the lone sniper who had derailed their perfect attack. Ruiz gasped. "James, they're choosing us over the whole hill." "Good," Harlan said quietly, chambering another round. "Then we're doing something right." 3 soldiers burst through the brush only 20 yards away. Harlan dropped 2 instantly. The third dove behind a tree, firing wildly. Bullets punched into the ground near Harlan's hand. He rolled right, slid down a slick patch of mud, and came up in a kneeling position behind a mossy boulder. Another burst of AK fire cracked like thunder. He fired back 1 bullet. Clean. Precise. The third attacker slumped forward. But now the enemy was almost on top of them. Shadows closed in from the left. More from the right. Their boots pounded the ground. Their war cries echoed through the trees. Ruiz whispered, voice cracking, "We're gonna get overrun. We're actually gonna get overrun." Harlan didn't answer. He just lifted his rifle, wiped rain from his eye, and whispered to himself, "Not yet." Then he stood his ground against the rushing dark. The fight in the fog had only begun. The ridge erupted in chaos. The moment the battalion opened fire, the jungle transformed from a silent void into a battlefield of blinding muzzle flashes, ricocheting gunfire, and shouts lost in the roar of combat. Flares burst over the canopy, turning fog into a white hellscape. Leaves spun through the air like burning paper. This was it, the full NVA assault. And it hit like a hammer. Harlan and Ruiz crouched low as bullets shredded the ground around them. The NVA were no longer trying to flank. They were charging in a full sprint, willing to absorb casualties just to silence the sniper. Ruiz reloaded with trembling hands. "James, they're surrounding us. We gotta fall back to the line." But falling back meant one thing. The NVA would redirect their full momentum toward the battalion's weakest flank. Harlan wasn't about to let that happen. He scanned through the fading fog and spotted exactly what he feared, an NVA RPG team pushing up the right-hand slope, moving low and fast, using terrain perfectly. An RPG could tear a hole straight through Bravo Company's center. Harlan whispered, "I need clear sightlines. Cover me." Ruiz's eyes widened. "Cover you? With what?" Harsh language, but Harlan was already moving. He slid down the mud-slick ridge like a skier, boots carving trenches through wet leaves, one hand steadied on his rifle. Bullets sparked against rock as he dove behind a fallen tree split open by shrapnel. The RPG gunner paused to aim. Harlan fired. The round burst through the gunner's cheek, dropping him instantly. The assistant gunner reached for the launcher. Harlan shot him too. The RPG rolled harmlessly downhill. "Two down," Harlan murmured, shifting positions. He fired again, striking the NVA squad leader, coordinating the push. The entire flank hesitated, but hesitation couldn't stop the momentum. Not tonight. More NVA appeared, dozens crashing through the trees, firing, shouting, advancing like a living tide. The battalion's M60S hammered back, but the jungle absorbed most of the sound and half the bullets. Captain Markson's voice blasted across the radio. "They're breaking through on the right. We need suppressing fire. Where the hell is that sniper team?" Ruiz grabbed his handset, breathless. Bravo sniper, still engaged, heavy contact. Harlan barely heard him. Through his scope, he watched the battlefield, like a surgeon watching a failing patient. He didn't fire randomly. Every shot mattered. Every bullet had a purpose. Take out the man coordinating. Take out the man carrying explosives. Take out the man with the radio. Take out the man whose courage inspires the rest. Sniping wasn't killing. It was editing the battlefield. Down below, a new shape emerged. Another RPG team sprinting to replace the fallen one. This one had better discipline. They moved in a V formation, covering each other, closing fast. Harlan ejected the spent casing, chambered a fresh round. He whispered to himself, "Not today." He fired. The squad leader collapsed. But the gunner didn't stop. He sprinted harder, dropping into a kneel to fire upslope. Huiz screamed, "RPG! James, he's got a shot." Harlan didn't think. He didn't breathe. He fired mid-sprint, sliding across the mud on one knee. The bullet struck the RPG gunner just as he pulled the trigger. The rocket discharged wild, arcing into the trees far to the left and exploded harmlessly in the canopy. Ruiz exhaled, stunned. "Holy hell, how did you—" "Later," Harlan said. "Reload." But the NVA weren't breaking. A fresh wave surged forward, even thicker than before. Machine gunners, grenade throwers, sappers with satchel charges. This wasn't a probing assault anymore. This was an annihilation push. The battalion line behind them groaned under the pressure. Men shouted for more ammo. Radiomen screamed coordinates. Mortar crews fired desperately into the fog, shells exploding so close the ground shook beneath Harlan's elbows. Markson's voice cracked through the radio. "They're through. They're in the ravine." Ruiz's face drained of color. "If they flank from the ravine, the whole line collapses. We'll get sliced right down the middle." Harlan already knew. He looked at his spotter, his friend. "Danny, I need you to get back to the line." Ruiz shook violently. "No, I'm not leaving you alone out here." "You have to," Harlan said softly. "Tell them where the breach is. Tell them to shift the M60S to cover it." "What about you?" Harlan's jaw tightened. "I'll hold the ravine." Ruiz stared at him as gunfire thundered across the ridge. "James, that's suicide." Harlan ejected another casing and rose into a low crouch. "No," he said. "It's buying time." Gunfire roared. The fog glowed red. The screams grew louder. And Corporal James Harlan sprinted alone toward the ravine, toward the weakest point of the line, toward the heart of the enemy assault. Because if he didn't, 468 men would die before sunrise. The ravine was a narrow scar carved into the hillside 20 feet deep, choked with roots and twisted vines, invisible in daylight and lethal in darkness. If the NVA broke through here, they would split the Rakkasans in half like snapping a bone. Harlan reached it at a sprint, sliding to his knees behind a cluster of boulders, breathing hard, mud streaking across his face. The sound below hit him immediately. Footsteps. Dozens. Fast. They were already inside. He bit down hard, chambering around as Ruiz's distant voice faded behind him, shouting something he could no longer hear. This part of the hill was barely defended, just 2 riflemen and a machine gun team somewhere farther upslope. They had no idea a full NVA wedge was tunneling straight toward them through the ravine. Harlan dropped flat on his stomach, crawled to the edge, and peeked down. The sight punched the air out of him. An entire NVA squad, maybe more, moving low and fast, using the ravine as a natural trench, rushing uphill in perfect silence. Their helmets shone faintly in the flare light. Their rifles were raised. Their boots kicked mud in a steady rhythm. And at the very front was a sapper carrying a satchel charge. If he reached the machine gun nest, it was over. Harlan exhaled slowly, steadied the rifle on a rock, and fired. The sapper pitched forward, the satchel exploding prematurely in a blinding flash that disintegrated 3 soldiers and filled the ravine with smoke. Shouts erupted. The NVA scattered for cover. But there was nowhere to hide. Not from him. Harlan fired again, and again, and again. Every shot found a target. Every bullet bent the assault's momentum. Men fell into the mud as chaos spread in waves. One soldier tried to climb the ravine wall. Harlan dropped him instantly. Another raised a radio handset. Harlan shot the handset clean out of his grip, then shot him a heartbeat later. He shifted positions, rolling behind the next rock outcrop before the return fire exploded around him, snapping branches, kicking dirt into his eyes. AK rounds ricocheted off stone in bursts of angry sparks. The NVA finally realized they weren't facing a full defensive line. They were facing one man, and they reacted with fury. A squad of 6 scrambled forward, hugging the ravine wall, firing upward as they advanced. Harlan pivoted left, propped the rifle between 2 roots, and took them out one by one, methodical, unfazed, like he was punching holes in paper. 4 shots. 5. 6. Each one dropped a soldier, but they kept coming. A new wedge pushed in from below, larger than the first 15, maybe 20 soldiers, moving with renewed determination, firing as they climbed. Muzzle flashes lit their faces in fleeting pulses. Harlan wiped blood from his eyebrow. He didn't know when he'd been cut and braced the rifle again. His heartbeat slowed. His mind sharpened. But they kept coming. He fired at the point man. Then the grenadier. Then the RPD gunner. Each shot punched a hole in the assault. Still they advanced. A grenade landed to his right. Harlan rolled, mud splashing, as the explosion ripped through the earth and showered him with debris. His ears rang, his hands shook. But he held the rifle tight. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding the fate of the battalion. More soldiers appeared below, silhouettes in the glowing fog, climbing over the bodies of their own fallen comrades. Harlan whispered to himself, "Stay with me, not yet." He fired again, dropped another, reloaded with trembling fingers. Fired again. The ravine was filling with bodies now. He could hear moans, shouting, the metallic clatter of rifles dropping into mud. And then finally, the momentum shifted. The NVA stopped pushing forward. They regrouped, lower down, unsure, disorganized. Their wedge had lost its spear point. Their nerve was breaking. From the battalion line above, an M60 finally swung into position and unleashed hell. A torrent of tracers poured into the ravine, cutting through fog like incandescent ropes. The NVA soldiers, already slowed by Harlan's precision, were now trapped in a killing zone. A torrent of tracers poured into the ravine, cutting through fog like incandescent ropes. The NVA soldiers, already slowed by Harlan's precision, were now trapped in a killing zone. Harlan rolled onto his back, chest heaving. He had fired until his arms felt numb, until the recoil bruised his shoulder raw. But he wasn't done. He forced himself up, limbs shaking, and scanned the ravine again. The NVA weren't advancing. Not anymore. He had held them. Alone. Ruiz appeared behind him, gasping for breath, blood soaking his sleeve. "James, Jesus, James, you stopped them. You actually stopped them." Harlan didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He only wiped mud from his scope and said quietly, "They'll try again," because he knew this was only one wave, and the night was far from over. For a brief moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe less, the ravine went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of victory. It was the quiet of two exhausted forces gasping before the next collision. Then the jungle inhaled again. Shadows moved deeper down the ravine. Boots stomped in mud. Metal clinked. Orders hissed through clenched teeth. The NVA weren't done. They were regrouping. Harlan wiped his scope on his sleeve, but the lens came back, streaked with mud and blood. His shoulder throbbed from recoil. His cheek weld felt raw. His fingers trembled so badly he had to steady the rifle with both hands. Ruiz crouched behind him, face pale, eyes wide. "James, we can't stop another push. Not like that." There were, 40 of them? 50? Harlan didn't answer. He was watching the ravine, listening, thinking. They would come again, but not the same way. The NVA commander had realized the mistake. Rushing a bottleneck left them vulnerable to snipers and machine guns. They would adapt, fan out wider, look for a new access point. But the terrain offered only one real option: flank left and climb the exposed ridge. Harlan turned his head slightly. "That side slope, how many riflemen covering it?" Ruiz swallowed. 2, maybe 3 if the second squad hasn't been hit." "Not enough. Not even close." Ruiz swallowed. 2, maybe 3 if the second squad hasn't been hit." Harlan's mind raced. Then he made his decision, the kind only a sniper could make. "We're moving." Ruiz blinked. "Moving where?" "Left ridge. Before they do." "James, we're out of position. They'll shoot us to pieces." Harlan already had the rifle slung over his shoulder. "They break through that ridge. The battalion is finished. We don't have a choice." Ruiz stared at him like a man watching someone step willingly into fire. But he followed anyway. They crawled along a narrow animal path, mud slick, branches clawing at their uniforms, bodies pressed low to hide their silhouettes. Gunfire thundered behind them where the battalion fought to stabilize the line. The ground shook with mortar blasts. Flares lit the sky in bursts of ghostly white. Halfway to the ridge, Ruiz slipped, sliding down a wet slope. Harlan grabbed his collar, hauling him back up. "You good?" Harlan whispered. Ruiz nodded shakily. Yeah. They continued. As they approached the ridge, Harlan's worst fear materialized. Movement. Lots of it. Shadows climbing in a crawling pattern, low, deliberate, minimizing silhouettes. This wasn't an impulsive charge. This was a coordinated flanking maneuver, textbook perfect, designed to break the spine of an American perimeter. Harlan counted at least 15, maybe 20, and more coming behind them. "They're gonna hit the ridge in under a minute," Ruiz whispered. Harlan counted at least 15, maybe 20, and more coming behind them. "They're gonna hit the ridge in under a minute," Ruiz whispered. Harlan slid behind a tree trunk and rested his rifle on a protruding root. "No, they're gonna hit me first." Ruiz's voice cracked. "That's suicide, James." Harlan didn't look away from the scope. "Danny, get back and warn Markson. Tell him the flank is coming." Ruiz hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. But he knew Harlan wasn't asking. He was commanding. Ruiz nodded slowly, then disappeared into the fog. Harlan was alone. He centered the crosshairs on the lead climber. The man's face was smeared with charcoal, eyes glinting in flare light. His shoulders moved with ruthless determination. Harlan fired. The man dropped backward. The rest froze, then scattered for cover. Good. Movement slowed meant time gained. He shifted, fired again. A radio man fell, his handset skittering down the slope. He fired again. An RPD gunner collapsed onto his own weapon. He fired again. A sapper carrying a satchel charge toppled sideways, arms flailing. But with each shot, the attackers adapted, angling, crouching, spreading, becoming harder to hit. They fired back in tight bursts, their AK rounds slicing through the vegetation around Harlan's head. He ducked, rolled to a new position, fired from a prone angle. 2 more went down. But with each shot, the attackers adapted, angling, crouching, spreading, becoming harder to hit. They fired back in tight bursts, their AK rounds slicing through the vegetation around Harlan's head. But with each shot, the attackers adapted, angling, crouching, spreading, becoming harder to hit. They fired back in tight bursts, their AK rounds slicing through the vegetation around Harlan's head. He ducked, rolled to a new position, fired from a prone angle. Branches exploded. Dirt sprayed against his face. A bullet snapped past so close it tore the strap on his helmet. Still he fought. The ridge echoed with overlapping gunfire. The enemy roared as they advanced. Harlan's rifle grew hot in his hands. Then he heard it. A voice young, terrified from the battalion line. "They're breaking through. Fall back. They're coming over the ridge." And Harlan's stomach twisted, because he knew that voice wasn't lying. The NVA had spotted him. They were accelerating. 20 yards. 15. 10. Silhouettes rose over the ridge crest, helmeted shadows. Rifles raised, blades glinting. Ruiz wasn't back yet. Reinforcements hadn't arrived. No one was left to hold the flank. Except him. Harlan chambered his last full magazine. He planted his knee. He steadied the rifle. He whispered to himself, "Just a little longer. Hold them just a little longer." Then he fired into the wave, charging straight toward him. One man against the flood, inch by inch, holding back the end of the battalion. And for the second time that night, he fought alone. For a long, suffocating moment, Corporal James Harlan thought he was done. The NVA wave crested over the ridge with terrifying speed, silhouettes lunging through the fog, boots pounding the wet soil, rifles spitting fire so close the muzzle flashes stung his eyes. He emptied the last rounds of his magazine into the closest shapes and felt a grim certainty settle into his bones. He had run out of time. A bayonet screamed past his ear, slicing the air. Another soldier lunged from the right. 2 more burst through the brush, shouting war cries that shook the ground. Harlan swung the rifle like a club, smashing the buttstock into a jaw. He pivoted, ducked a bayonet, rolled behind a fallen trunk, and drew his sidearm just as another attacker burst through the fog. The .45 barked. The soldier dropped. Another climbed over him. Another followed. Harlan kept firing until the slide locked back. Then nothing left. The ridge was collapsing around him. He grabbed a fist-sized rock, ready to go down swinging, when a roar split the valley. Not human, not NVA. An M60 machine gun opened up from behind, then a second, then a third. Tracers slashed through the fog like molten red threads. Branches exploded. Figures fell mid-step. Screams tore through the trees. The ridgeline behind Harlan came alive with American firepower. Ruiz's voice cut through the chaos, breaking with adrenaline. "James, down, get down now." Harlan dropped flat as a rain of bullets stitched across the slope, tearing apart the front rank of the NVA flank force. 7, 8, 10 silhouettes collapsed in seconds. An M60 machine gun opened up from behind, then a second, then a third. Tracers slashed through the fog like molten red threads. Branches exploded. Figures fell mid-step. Screams tore through the trees. The ridgeline behind Harlan came alive with American firepower. The NVA assault faltered, then buckled, then broke. Soldiers scrambled backward, dragging wounded, slipping on mud, colliding with each other in panic. The push that had nearly cut the battalion in half simply dissolved. Harlan lay gasping, staring at the sky as muzzle flashes lit the fog above him. His vision blurred with sweat, smoke, and exhaustion. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Ruiz, eyes wild, face streaked with soot. "James, you crazy bastard. You held them. You actually held them." But Harlan barely heard him, because the battle wasn't over. A horn blew from the valley floor, a long, mournful note that echoed through the jungle like a wounded animal. Instantly, the remaining NVA forces disengaged. They melted into the fog, vanishing between the trees, disappearing as fast as they had appeared. No retreat order, no regroup signal, just silence. A broken silence. The Americans held their breath, half expecting another rush, another flurry of gunfire, another ambush from the dark. Nothing. The jungle, after hours of violence, exhaled. For the first time since midnight, Harlan felt the weight of his body. His limbs shook. His breathing rasped, shallow and painful. He rolled onto his back, staring through the thinning fog toward the faint gray glow stretching across the treetops. Dawn. The sky, once pitch black, was becoming a pale smear of blue and silver. Flares no longer mattered. The jungle slowly revealed itself in soft, unforgiving light. All around them, the cost of the night began to show. Shell craters, shredded trees, bodies, American and NVA, scattered along the ridge. Spent casings piled ankle-deep, the ravine piled with motionless shapes. Officers moved between positions, checking on survivors, calling for medics, whispering the names of men who would never respond again. All around them, the cost of the night began to show. "Harlan," he breathed. "Christ, you're alive." Harlan tried to sit up but winced. Ruiz supported him from behind. Captain Markson fought his way up the slope toward Harlan, panting, sweat running down his neck. Ruiz laughed under his breath, half hysterical. "Sir." That was all him. Markson looked at Harlan as though seeing him for the first time. "You held the breach," he said quietly. "If they'd gotten past you, the battalion would have folded. We'd be calling home 500 families today." Harlan lowered his gaze, uncomfortable. "I just slowed them down, that's all." Markson shook his head. "No, you stopped them." Sunlight pierced through the fog now, stripping away the dreamlike horror of the night. The Hill 482 finally became a shape again, a real place, solid, graspable, but the men who had defended it stood in stunned silence, understanding only as dawn revealed the truth. They had survived something that should have killed them, all because of one sniper with a steady hand and an iron will. Behind them, medics carried the wounded. Engineers gathered abandoned rifles. Officers scribbled casualty reports with shaking hands. But more than one man paused, looked down into the ravine, and whispered, "How the hell did he do this alone?" Harlan didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. He only knew one thing. The sun was rising, and he was still alive. The sun rose slow and reluctant, as if unsure whether it should shine on what remained of Hill 482. Mist still clung to the ground, rolling over fallen branches and bodies. softening the outlines of a battlefield that had nearly become a graveyard. Corporal James Harlan sat on a crate near the makeshift aid station, his uniform soaked with mud and blood, some of it his, most of it not. Medics had insisted on checking him for wounds, but aside from bruises, a cracked cheekbone, and a deep cut just under his eye, he was still standing. Barely. Ruiz limped over with his arm in a sling, grinning despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "You look like hell," Ruiz said. Harlan shrugged. "Feels about right. Sir wants to see you." Of course he did. Harlan followed Ruiz toward the command tent, stepping over the debris of a night he would never forget. Mortar fins stuck out of the earth like steel flowers. Rifle stocks lay snapped in half. Flares, half-burned, smoked gently in the new sunlight. The bodies had been moved to one side covered in ponchos, identified with tags, but the rows felt endless. "Sir wants to see you." "You sit," Markson said, pointing at an ammo crate. Harlan sat. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the wounded drifted in groans, whispered prayers, the clatter of medical tools. A helicopter thundered overhead, rotors thumping like a heartbeat too slow to save anyone. Finally, Markson exhaled. Inside the tent, Captain Markson stood with a radio operator and 2 lieutenants, all of them looking as if they'd aged years in a few hours. When Markson saw Harlan, he dismissed the others. He met Harlan's eyes. "We would have lost the entire battalion. I've been doing casualty numbers," he said. "I won't sugarcoat it. We lost good men last night, more than I'm ready to accept." He paused, swallowed. "But if the NVA had broken through the ravine and the ridge, we wouldn't have lost a platoon. We wouldn't have lost a company." Harlan stood, wincing from the bruises. "I did what any man would have done if he could have heard what I heard. If he'd seen what I saw." Harlan shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. The M60 teams, the rifle squads, they backed you up," Markson said sharply. "You were the one who bought them the chance to do it." He reached into a pocket and pulled out a folded notepad, reading from a scrawled list. Confirmed targets: 9 officers, 3 radiomen, 2 RPG teams, at least 6 machine gunners, several sappers, a dozen riflemen. And that's just what we could identify. Markson closed the notepad. "Those numbers don't exist for a single shooter. They just don't." Harlan didn't reply. He wasn't proud. He wasn't elated. He was simply tired. Harlan looked down at his boots, caked in red mud. Harlan's jaw clenched. He stared at the ground, breathing slowly. Markson frowned. "That doesn't look like good news to you." Harlan looked down at his boots, caked in red mud. Markson blinked. "What do you mean you don't want—" "You sit," Markson said, pointing at an ammo crate. Harlan stood, wincing from the bruises. "I did what any man would have done if he could have heard what I heard. If he'd seen what I saw." Harlan didn't argue. He didn't need to. Markson blinked. "What do you mean you don't want—" He walked out of the tent, leaving Markson stunned, and made his way to the edge of the hill where the sunrise glowed orange through the thinning fog. Ruiz joined him, silent, standing shoulder to shoulder. Markson continued. "I talked to every platoon sergeant on the line. They all said the same thing." He leaned forward. "Son, you didn't just hold off an attack. You held off an army." Harlan nodded. Harlan didn't argue. He didn't need to. Ruiz sighed, looking down at the ravine filled with bodies. "You know, the guys are already telling stories about last night." Harlan didn't answer. "They're saying one sniper saved all of us." Ruiz sighed, looking down at the ravine filled with bodies. "You know, the guys are already telling stories about last night." Harlan nodded. "Stories change," Harlan murmured. A helicopter swooped low, kicking up dust. Men ducked, shielding their eyes. Harlan grabbed his pack light, bare, carrying only what he needed, and slung it over his shoulder. Harlan offered the faintest smile, tired, worn, but real. "I'll try." He walked toward the waiting chopper, boots crunching on spent casings and shattered wood. As he climbed inside, he glanced back once at the hill, the forgotten place that had almost been the end. Harlan offered the faintest smile, tired, worn, but real. Harlan nodded. He would finish his tour. He would survive the war. But he wouldn't speak of Hill 482 again. Not for decades. Not until the records were declassified and surviving, Rakkasans told their stories, every one of them repeating the same simple truth. A sniper no one noticed. A hill no one remembered. A night no one survived except because of him. Not until the records were declassified and surviving, Rakkasans told their stories, every one of them repeating the same simple truth. Not for decades.